The session was booked for 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in early 1968 at a small recording facility just off 8th Avenue in Manhattan. Not a famous studio, not the kind of place where history was supposed to happen. The control room smelled like cigarette smoke and old coffee. The walls were covered with foam acoustic panels that had started to peel at the corners. Someone had taped a magazine photograph of muddy waters above the mixing console, and it had been there so long the tape had yellowed. Johnny Winter arrived early. He always arrived early. It was a habit he'd carried since his first gigs in Beaumont, Texas, when showing up late meant someone else got your slot and you drove home without a dollar. Even now, with his name starting to appear in the right places, small mentions in trade publications, whispers from club bookers in Chicago and New York, he arrived early, set up his gear, and waited. He liked the quiet before other musicians filled a room. It gave him time to think without anyone watching. He sat down with his sunburst Gibson ES-125 and started running scales. Not to warm up. He didn't need to warm up. His fingers moved the way other people breathed, without thought, without effort, at a speed that made watching him uncomfortable, like looking directly at something your eyes weren't quite built to process. He played scales because playing scales was honest. You couldn't hide in a scale. Every note landed alone and clean, and you either hit it or you didn't. The engineer came in, nodded at Johnny, and started arranging cables without speaking. Then someone knocked on the doorframe. Johnny had been told in the vague way these things were communicated in 1968, through a mutual friend of a friend, through a phone call he half remembered, that a guitarist named Jimi Hendrix might stop by. He knew the name. Everybody in the scene knew the name by then. Are You Experienced had come out the previous year and landed like a stone dropped through a glass floor. Johnny had listened to it once, placed it carefully back in its sleeve, and hadn't played it again. Not because it wasn't good, because it was the kind of record you needed to be in a certain mood to survive. He figured Jimmy would be late. Famous people were always late. He wasn't. Jimmy walked in at 3:52, carrying a white Stratocaster and wearing a purple jacket with fringe along the sleeves that swayed when he moved. He was quieter than Johnny expected. He looked around the room the way a person looks at a room they've been in 100 times before, without curiosity, just assessment, cataloging exits and corners, and the position of the amplifiers. He saw Johnny and crossed the room and shook his hand. "Heard a lot about you," Jimmy said. "Same," Johnny said. That was the entire introduction. They plugged in and started with a 12-bar in E, the most honest greeting two blues guitarists can offer each other. Johnny played rhythm first, finding the pocket, letting Jimmy take the lead. Jimmy's playing was exactly what Johnny had known it would be from the record. Expansive, chromatic, bending notes to places they had no business going, and somehow making it sound inevitable. He played with the easy authority of someone who had never once wondered whether he belonged in a room. Johnny listened. He nodded. He watched Jimmy's hands in the way you watch a card trick, knowing you're being fooled, wanting to catch the moment, never quite catching it. After a few minutes, they switched. Jimmy played rhythm and Johnny stepped forward. And here is what happened. Johnny Winter played fast. He played faster than almost anyone in a generation that prized speed, faster than guitarists who had dedicated their lives exclusively to its pursuit. His right hand was a blur. His left hand moved across the fretboard with a precision that musicians who'd seen it up close described the same way, independently, without having spoken to each other, like watching a machine that had learned to feel something. He played a run in E, 16 notes, then 32, then a phrase so dense and rapid it stopped being individual notes and became a single extended vowel of sound, a sustained exhalation from the guitar that should not have been physically possible. The engineer in the control room looked up from his console. Jimmy listened. He did not move. He stood with the Stratocaster hanging from his shoulder, his right hand resting loosely against the body of the guitar, and he watched Johnny play, and his expression was the expression of someone doing math in their head. Not surprised, not threatened. Something more like interested, like he was following a line of reasoning to see where it would arrive. When Johnny finished the run, he looked up. Jimmy nodded once. "You're fast," he said. "I know," Johnny said. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then Jimmy started playing. He didn't play fast. That was the first thing Johnny registered. Not consciously, not as a decision, but somewhere lower, in the part of the mind that processes music before language catches up to it. Jimmy was not trying to match speed. He wasn't competing with what Johnny had just played. He was doing something else entirely, something Johnny didn't immediately have a word for. Jimmy played slowly, deliberately. He played 3 notes where Johnny would have played 15, and each of those 3 notes had a weight to it, a gravity, like each one was pulling the next one toward it across the silence between them. He bent the second note of the phrase by a half step, not a dramatic bend, not a showboat bend, just enough to make the note seem uncertain, to make it ask a question the third note would then refuse to fully answer. The room got very quiet. It wasn't loud. That was the thing Johnny kept returning to afterward, in the months that followed, in the years that followed. It wasn't loud at all. The amp was on a modest setting. Jimmy wasn't using feedback. He wasn't doing the things that had made him famous. The behind-the-back playing, the teeth, the theatrics that made audiences come unglued. He was just standing in a small room off 8th Avenue, playing quietly, and the air in the room had changed. Johnny could feel it the same way you feel a drop in barometric pressure before a storm, that prickling at the back of the neck that your body understands before your mind does. Jimmy played a phrase that descended the neck in half steps, letting each note ring until it almost but not quite resolved. And then he stopped. The sustain faded. The room was silent. Johnny Winter was looking at the floor. He didn't remember lowering his eyes. He just found them there, fixed on the scuffed linoleum, and when he raised them again, Jimmy was watching him with an expression that wasn't triumph or satisfaction. It was closer to patience, the expression of someone who had said something important and was willing to wait as long as necessary for it to land. Johnny opened his mouth. He closed it. He set his guitar down against the amplifier. Not dramatically, quietly, the way you set something down when your hands have temporarily stopped knowing what to do. They played for another hour after that. It became something good, a real conversation, 2 musicians who respected each other's language, even when they spoke it differently. But something had shifted in Johnny, quietly and completely, the way a bone sets differently after it's been broken. He kept playing fast because fast was true to him, was the way his particular mind experienced music, was the language his hands had developed over 10,000 hours. But he played it differently, more carefully, with a new awareness of the silence on either side of each phrase. When Jimmy left, he shook Johnny's hand the same way he'd arrived. Simple, direct, no performance to it. "Good playing," Jimmy said. "Yeah," Johnny said. And then after a moment, "You didn't try to outrun me." Jimmy looked at him. "I know." "Why not?" Jimmy considered the question. He picked up his case from the floor and settled the strap of the Stratocaster on his shoulder and looked at Johnny with that same expression. Patient, unhurried, like a man who had already decided what to say and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it. "Because that wasn't the question," he said. He walked out. The fringe on his jacket swayed and stilled. Johnny stood in the studio for a long time after that, not playing, just standing. The engineer had gone somewhere, out for coffee, to the bathroom, somewhere people go when they sense they are not needed. The room was empty and quiet, and the photograph of Muddy Waters looked down from above the console with the same flat, knowing expression it always had. Johnny picked up his guitar again eventually. He played a single note, let it ring, watched it fade. He talked about Jimmy often in the years that followed. Not the way some musicians talked about him, not reverently, not with a hushed tone of hagiography, but the way you talk about something that permanently reorganized your thinking. An event rather than a person, a before and an after. In a 1975 interview with a Texas music magazine, the interviewer asked him whether he thought Hendrix had ever encountered a guitarist who could match him technically. Johnny laughed at the question, a short, genuine laugh, not dismissive. "You're asking the wrong thing," he said. "Technique was never the point. I could outrun him. I could outrun most people. It doesn't mean anything. Jimmy taught me that in about 3 minutes." He paused. The interviewer waited. "I watched him play that day," Johnny continued, And I realized I had been asking myself the wrong question my entire career. I was always asking, how fast can I play this? How clean can I play this? Can I play it better than the last time? And those are fine questions. But Jimmy was asking something completely different. He was asking, what does this note need to say? And when you're asking that question, speed is just a tool. Sometimes you need it. Sometimes you don't. He knew the difference. I was still figuring it out. Later, in a 1982 interview, he was asked which guitarist had affected him most. He didn't hesitate. Jimi Hendrix, he said, and not because of what he could do, because of what he chose not to do. The interviewer pressed him. Could he explain what he meant? Johnny thought about it for a moment. I was faster than him, he said. That afternoon at the studio, I played faster than he did. I played more notes. Technically, by any metric you could measure, I was ahead on that particular thing. He stopped. And none of it mattered. He played 3 notes and the room stopped. That's not technique. I don't have a word for what that is. I've been looking for the word for 15 years. He shook his head slowly. Maybe there isn't one. Johnny Winter went on to record some of the most ferocious blues guitar the genre had ever seen. His albums in the late 60s and early 70s became touchstones. Proof that the blues could contain velocity without losing its soul, that speed and feeling were not opposites, that a white kid from Beaumont, Texas, could speak the language with the fluency of a native. He never stopped playing fast. It was too much who he was to abandon. But people who played with him after 1968 noticed something different in his phrasing, a new quality in the spaces between the runs, a willingness to let notes breathe, to let silence participate, a restraint that had not been there before, not as a limitation, but as a choice, a conscious decision made by a man who had learned the difference between the two. When Jimmy died in September 1970, Johnny was on tour. He heard the news in a hotel room somewhere in the Midwest. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time and didn't call anyone and didn't turn on the television. He just sat. At his show that night, he played for 3.5 hours without stopping. It was the longest set he had ever played, and by the end his fingers were bleeding, and the audience stood in stunned silence when he finally stopped and set his guitar down and walked off stage without a word. Someone asked him about it later. What had happened that night? Why 3.5 hours? Johnny Winter looked out the window for a moment before answering. I was trying to say something, he said. I was trying to find the right 3 notes. He paused. I never did. He said it without drama. Just a statement of fact, plain and final. The kind of sentence that doesn't need anything after it. The kind of sentence Jimmy would have understood.